I never imagined the deepest betrayal of my life would come wrapped in concern. It did not arrive with shouting or slammed doors. It came quietly, through gentle suggestions, careful questions, and a growing sense that my own judgment was no longer trusted. One moment, I was a mother who believed she had done everything right. The next, I was being studied, managed, and slowly pushed aside in my own life. By the time I realized what was happening, the damage was already deep. And the hardest truth was this: the person preparing to take everything from me was my own son. Before we dive into today's story, take a moment to share where you're watching from. We love seeing how our stories bring people together from every corner of the world. Your thoughts and comments are what make this community so special, and we're truly grateful to have you here. If you haven't already, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss a new story filled with drama, resilience, and unexpected twists. Now, settle in, get comfortable, and maybe grab your favorite drink, because this is a tale you won't want to miss. Let's get started. My name is Emily Miller, and I am 62 years old. I live alone in a small coastal town in New England, the kind of place people imagine when they think of quiet mornings, narrow streets, and houses that have stood longer than most memories. My home sits a few blocks from the ocean. On clear days, I can hear the waves if I open the kitchen window early enough, before the traffic and the voices of the town wake up. I have lived in this house for more than 25 years. It is not large, and it was never meant to impress anyone. It has 2 bedrooms, 1 bathroom, and a small backyard where the grass refuses to grow evenly, no matter how much effort I put into it. But it is mine. Every corner carries traces of the life I built slowly, carefully, and mostly alone. I wake up early, not because I have to anymore, but because my body has not learned how to do otherwise. Retirement did not erase decades of routine. I make tea, not coffee, and I sit at the small table near the window. From there, I can see a thin strip of water between the houses across the street. That quiet moment in the morning is when I feel most like myself, before the weight of memories settles in. I raised my son on my own. His father left when he was still a toddler, walking out of our lives with promises that never found their way back. I did not chase after him. I did not have the energy or the time. I had a child to raise, rent to pay, and a future to somehow piece together without a safety net. I worked steadily, sometimes more than one job, and learned very quickly how to stretch a dollar until it almost tore. I never remarried. People asked, sometimes gently, sometimes with concern, but the truth was simple. Every part of me was focused on being a mother. I told myself there would be time later, that once my son was grown and settled, I would finally think about myself. Years passed faster than I expected. My son, Sam, is now in his late 30s. He has a good job, a wife, and a house much larger than mine. From the outside, his life looks exactly the way I once hoped it would. I am proud of him. I always have been. That pride never disappeared, even as our relationship changed shape over the years. Sam does not visit often. When he does, it is usually brief. He comes with plans already waiting for him somewhere else, his phone never far from his hand. I learned not to ask questions that might make him uncomfortable. I told myself that this was normal, that grown children drift away, that this was the natural order of things. I live on my pension now. It is modest, but it is enough. I budget carefully, just as I always have. I do not travel much, and I do not spend impulsively. I know exactly what comes in and what goes out each month. I have always taken quiet pride in that. Managing my own life, my own money, has been one of the few things that always felt firmly under my control. Still, there are moments when I feel something I cannot fully explain. A subtle shift, a sense that the balance between Sam and me is no longer what I believed it to be. It is not anger, not yet. It is more like standing on familiar ground and realizing, too late, that it has started to tilt. At the time, I did not know that this feeling was a warning. I only knew that my peaceful, predictable life was about to change in ways I could not yet see, and that the quiet I depended on was more fragile than I ever imagined. If you're still watching and starting to sense that something isn't quite right beneath the surface, comment number 1 below, so I know you're with me. What seems like concern is about to reveal another face. Now let's move on to chapter 2. Sam came over one afternoon without calling ahead, which was unusual enough to catch my attention. I was in the kitchen, rinsing dishes and enjoying the quiet hum of the house, when I heard his car pull up outside. For a brief moment, I felt that familiar flicker of relief, the kind a mother feels when her child shows up unexpectedly. I dried my hands, straightened my sweater, and reminded myself not to read too much into small things. He looked well, as always. Clean jacket, confident posture, the faint scent of expensive cologne that lingered in the doorway after he stepped inside. We sat at the kitchen table, the same one where he had once done homework and eaten countless meals. I made tea out of habit, moving through the motions automatically, while he looked around the room with an expression I could not quite place. At first, the conversation stayed light. He asked about my health, about the weather, about a neighbor he vaguely remembered. His voice was calm, measured, almost rehearsed. I noticed he did not really look at me when I spoke. His eyes drifted instead to the cabinets, the counter, the small stack of mail near the sink. Then his tone shifted. He began talking about how complicated life had become, how easy it was for people to make mistakes with money, especially later in life. He mentioned stories he had read, people my age being taken advantage of, losing their savings because they trusted the wrong person. He spoke carefully, choosing his words as if laying something fragile on the table between us. He said he worried about me. I listened without interrupting, my hands wrapped tightly around my mug. Part of me appreciated the concern. Another part felt strangely exposed, as if my independence had quietly been placed under review. When he suggested that maybe he could help keep an eye on my finances, I felt my chest tighten. He framed it gently. He did not demand anything. He said it would be easier for me, less stress, fewer things to manage. He talked about responsibility, about family looking out for one another. The words themselves were reasonable. It was the certainty behind them that unsettled me. I asked him what he meant exactly. He smiled and waved his hand, as if details were unnecessary. He said we could talk about it later, that he was only planting the idea. Still, he began asking questions. How much I received each month, whether I had savings, if my bills were on automatic payments. He already seemed to know some of the answers. As he spoke, I felt something shift inside me. I had spent decades managing my life carefully, quietly, without asking anyone for help. Now, I found myself sitting across from my own son, feeling as though I needed to justify my competence. I did not say no. I did not say yes either. I told him I would think about it. That response felt safer than confrontation. I watched his face closely when I said it. There was a brief pause, a flicker of impatience he tried to hide before nodding. When he left, the house felt different. Not emptier, but heavier. I sat back down at the table long after the sound of his car disappeared. The questions he asked replayed in my mind, sharper now that the room was quiet again. I told myself he meant well. I reminded myself that children worry about their parents, that this was probably a natural stage of life. And yet, beneath those rational thoughts, something else lingered. A discomfort I could not ignore. It felt less like concern and more like evaluation, as if my life had been measured and found lacking. That evening, I stood at the kitchen window watching the sky darken over the ocean. I realized that something fundamental had changed, even if I could not yet explain how. What Sam called help felt uncomfortably close to control, and for the first time, I wondered what would happen if I let him take that first step. If you're still here and feeling that uneasy shift in power, comment number 2 below to let me know you're paying attention, because what was just a suggestion is about to become pressure. Now, let's move on to chapter 3. After Sam's visit, something in me stayed restless. The days that followed looked ordinary from the outside, but I moved through them with a quiet alertness I had never needed before. I found myself replaying his words, the careful tone he had used, the way his questions had felt less like concern and more like inspection. I told myself I was being sensitive, yet that explanation no longer brought comfort. Sam began stopping by more often. Not long visits, never unannounced affection or casual conversation, but purposeful appearances. Each time his eyes moved through the house before settling on me. He asked if I needed help organizing things, if I had considered downsizing, if some items were no longer practical. He spoke as though he were already halfway into a role I had never agreed to give him. It was during one of those quiet afternoons that I made a decision I did not fully understand myself at the time. I started with small things, an old armchair in the living room that had lost its shape years ago, a wooden cabinet I had kept out of habit more than use. Later, the television I rarely watched. I contacted a local reseller, arranged pickups, and watched the rooms grow barer with each removal. I told myself I needed the space, that fewer things meant less clutter, less responsibility. But somewhere deeper, I knew that was not the whole truth. I wanted to see what would happen. I wanted to know whether Sam's concern was truly about me or about something else entirely. The answer came sooner than I expected. Sam arrived one evening and froze in the doorway. His eyes moved quickly from one empty corner to another, his jaw tightening with each step he took inside. He did not ask how I was. He did not sit down. He asked where everything had gone. I explained calmly that I had sold some things, that I no longer needed them, that the money would help. The words sounded reasonable even to my own ears, but his reaction was anything but calm. His voice rose, sharp and incredulous, demanding to know why I had not talked to him first. In that moment, I felt something break open inside me, not loudly, not dramatically, but with the clarity of a truth finally revealed. He was not worried about my comfort. He was angry because I had acted without permission, because I had changed something he believed he had a claim to. He paced the living room, gesturing at the empty spaces, listing inconveniences that had nothing to do with my needs. He spoke about how impractical my decision was, how impulsive. He suggested I had not thought it through. Each sentence carried the same message, wrapped in different words. I was no longer being treated as the owner of my own life. I watched him then, really watched him, and for the first time I did not recognize my son. The frustration on his face was not fear for my well-being. It was resentment, the kind that comes when control is challenged. When he finally left, the door closed harder than necessary. The silence that followed felt heavier than before, but also clearer. I sat in the middle of my stripped-down living room, surrounded by bare walls and open space, and realized I was no longer confused. The house felt different, lighter in some ways, but exposed. And yet, as I looked around, I understood something that unsettled me more than his anger. The problem had never been the furniture. It was the assumption behind his reaction, the belief that my choices required his approval. That night, I did not sleep much. I lay awake listening to the distant sound of the ocean and replaying the moment his concern turned into accusation. I stopped telling myself that I was imagining things. The crack had appeared, and once I saw it, I could not pretend it was not there. This was not a misunderstanding. It was the beginning of something else. And for the first time, I knew I would have to decide how far I was willing to let it go. If you're still watching and starting to realize this was never just about help, comment number 3 below so I know you're following closely. The first real line has been crossed, and there's no going back. Now let's move on to chapter 4. After that evening, my days took on a different texture. Nothing dramatic changed on the surface, yet I felt as though I had stepped into a room where the light was harsher and every detail sharper. I paid closer attention to my routines, to the mail I opened, to the way my phone buzzed more often with Sam's name lighting up the screen. Each message sounded polite enough, but there was an insistence beneath the words that made me uneasy. He called to ask if I had thought more about making things easier. He suggested organizing my finances, streamlining my accounts, putting everything in one place. The language was smooth and confident, the tone of someone already certain of the outcome. I answered carefully, keeping my responses brief. I did not want to argue, but I also did not want to surrender. A few days later, Sam came by carrying a thin folder under his arm. He placed it on the kitchen table as if it were an ordinary thing, no different from a grocery bag or a stack of mail. He said it contained some documents that would help him look after things for me. He spoke as though the decision had already been made, and this was merely a formality. I opened the folder slowly. Inside were several pages filled with small print and official language. Authorizations, permissions, access. Words that felt heavy the longer I stared at them. I read each line carefully, my finger tracing the margins as I moved down the page. It was not just help he was asking for, it was control. For the first time in my life, I did not sign something placed in front of me simply to keep the peace. I told him I needed time to think. The room grew still. His expression changed, only slightly, but enough for me to notice. He said it was simple, that there was nothing to worry about, that delaying only complicated things. I repeated that I needed time. What followed was not an argument, but something colder. He sighed, reminded me of my age, mentioned how easily people forgot details or misunderstood paperwork. He spoke as though he were being patient, as though my hesitation were proof of his point. I felt a familiar sting of doubt rise up, but it did not settle the way it once might have. After he left, the papers remained on the table. I sat there long after the sound of his car disappeared, staring at the neat stack of pages. My hands were steady, but my thoughts raced. If I signed, I would no longer be the one deciding how my life was managed. I realized how easily I could lose everything without a single dramatic moment, just a signature given out of habit. That night, I took the documents into the bedroom and read them again under the lamp. I noticed details I might have missed before. The breadth of authority they granted, the absence of any clear limits. I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the evening air. A question formed that I could not push away. Had Sam already been making decisions for me without my knowledge? I did not confront him. Not yet. Instead, I placed the papers back in the folder and returned it to the kitchen table. I understood something then that surprised me with its calm certainty. If I reacted too quickly, I would lose whatever ground I still had. I needed facts, not arguments. Proof, not promises. The next morning, as I watched the light move slowly across the floor, I made a quiet decision. I would not sign anything. I would not accuse him. I would start paying attention in a way I never had before. I would trust my instincts instead of dismissing them as fear or confusion. The papers stayed where he had left them, untouched. And as I went about my day, I felt something unfamiliar taking shape inside me. Not anger, not panic, resolve. Whatever was happening, I was no longer willing to hand my life over without understanding the cost. If you're still with me and can feel the tension tightening, comment number 4 below to show you're still here. Because the next chapter is where the truth finally breaks through. Now let's move on to chapter 5. I did not confront Sam right away. Instead, I did what I had always done best when life became uncertain. I gathered information. One quiet morning, after the house had settled into its familiar stillness, I sat at the small desk in my bedroom and opened my financial records. I told myself I was only checking, only making sure everything matched what I believed to be true. Even then, a part of me already knew I would not like what I found. At first, nothing seemed wrong. The numbers looked familiar, the deposits predictable. Then I noticed a withdrawal that did not belong. It was not large enough to draw attention at a glance, but it was not something I remembered authorizing. I stared at the date, then at the amount, and felt a slow, creeping chill spread through me. I searched my memory, replaying that week, that day. Nothing came back. I kept going. Another transaction stood out, then another, each one small enough to hide among ordinary expenses, but together they formed a pattern I could no longer ignore. My hands remained steady as I scrolled, but my breathing changed. I felt as though the floor beneath my carefully ordered life had shifted without warning. As I traced the timing of the transactions, a realization settled over me with painful clarity. Sam had been at my house around those dates. I remembered the casual visits, the moments when my wallet sat unattended on the counter, the trust I had never questioned. The thought that followed made my stomach tighten. This was not an accident. I checked another account, then another. What I found there removed any remaining doubt. A credit account I did not remember opening. Changes to information I had never requested. This was not a single mistake or misunderstanding. It was deliberate, and it had been happening quietly, over time, while I believed I was safe. When Sam came by later that week, I asked him about it. I kept my voice even, my expression calm. I did not accuse him. I simply stated what I had found. The air in the room shifted instantly. He did not ask to see the statements. He did not express surprise. Instead, his posture stiffened and his tone hardened. He said there must be some confusion. He suggested I might be misreading things, that I had always been anxious about money. He spoke slowly, carefully, as though explaining something to a child. Each word carried the same message. I was mistaken. I could not be trusted with my own understanding. As he spoke, something inside me finally settled. The pain I felt in that moment was sharper than anything the missing money could explain. It was the realization that my son was not just taking from me. He was rewriting reality to protect himself, and he was willing to make me doubt my own mind to do it. I did not raise my voice. I did not argue. I watched him closely and understood with an awful clarity that he believed this would work, that I would back down, apologize, and let him take over. That had always been his expectation. When he left, he seemed confident, almost relieved. He believed he had regained control. I remained seated at the table long after the door closed, surrounded by the quiet of the house. My heart felt heavy, but my thoughts were clearer than they had been in weeks. I accepted the truth that afternoon. The son I had trusted with my life had chosen to see me as an obstacle, not a person. Whatever love he still felt was no longer enough to stop him from crossing lines that could not be uncrossed. That realization did not make me collapse. It steadied me. I understood then that this was no longer about explaining myself or appealing to his better nature. It was about protecting what was left of my independence and dignity. I gathered the statements and placed them carefully in a folder. I did not cry. I did not panic. I knew exactly what came next. Silence, for now, would be my strongest shield. And while Sam believed the conversation was over, I understood that the real battle had only just begun. After the truth surfaced, I did something that surprised even me. I went quiet. Not the fragile silence of fear, but a deliberate stillness, chosen with care. I did not call Sam. I did not reply to his messages. I did not attempt to explain what I knew or how I felt. I understood, with a clarity sharpened by pain, that any conversation now would only give him time to adjust his story. The quiet gave me room to think. I began gathering everything: bank statements from years back, credit reports I had never bothered to read closely, insurance paperwork tucked away in drawers I rarely opened. I spread them across my dining table and worked methodically, page by page. Patterns emerged where I had once seen coincidence. Dates aligned, amounts repeated. Small decisions I had never questioned formed a trail that led back to the same place every time. What unsettled me most was not the money itself, but the strategy behind it. This was not desperation, it was planning. And woven through it all was something more dangerous than theft. It was the steady erosion of my credibility, the comments about my age, the gentle reminders that memory fades, the way he had spoken to me, not as a partner in conversation, but as a liability to be managed. I realized then what I was truly at risk of losing. Not just savings, not just autonomy, my voice. The thought stayed with me as I made an appointment with a lawyer. Walking into that office felt heavier than any step I had taken in years. I had avoided this path instinctively, clinging to the belief that family matters should stay private. Sitting across from someone whose job it was to name wrongdoing forced me to face the reality I had been circling for weeks. I told my story without embellishment. I laid out the documents, the timelines, the moments that no longer made sense once placed under proper light. The lawyer listened carefully, without interruption, and then explained what I had suspected but had not dared to say aloud. This was financial exploitation. It was not a misunderstanding. It was not concern gone too far. It was a violation of trust with legal consequences. I left that meeting with a folder under my arm and a weight in my chest. The path forward was suddenly clear, and that clarity was terrifying. I understood what taking action would mean. The rupture would be permanent. There would be no pretending afterward, no quiet return to how things had been. For days, I sat with that knowledge. I walked along the shoreline in the early mornings, letting the cold air steady my thoughts. I asked myself every question I could think of, turning them over from every angle. Could I live with what would happen if I stayed silent? Could I accept the cost of speaking up? The answer came slowly, but it did not waver. Silence would not protect me. It would only teach him that this approach worked. I decided then that I would not sign anything. Not now, not ever. I would not hand over control in the name of peace. I would proceed carefully, with documentation and guidance, and without apology. Whatever remained of my relationship with my son would have to exist within boundaries I set, or not at all. There was no relief in that decision, only resolve. I knew the days ahead would be difficult. I knew I would be accused of cruelty, of overreaction, of betrayal. But as I stood in my kitchen that evening, looking at the same walls that had witnessed every stage of my life, I felt something I had not expected. I felt grounded. This choice would change everything. There was no undoing it. And for the first time since this began, I understood that choosing myself was not an act of abandonment. It was an act of survival. If you're still watching and understand how heavy this decision really is, comment number 6 below, so I know you're standing with me. The choice has been made, and now we face the consequences. Let's move on to Chapter 7. The shift came quickly after I stopped responding the way Sam expected. At first, the messages increased, short notes, followed by longer ones. Concern layered over irritation slipping into something sharper. I read them once, and then saved them, resisting the urge to explain myself. Every instinct I had as a mother told me to smooth things over, to reassure him, to restore the fragile peace. I ignored that instinct and trusted the silence instead. His tone changed when reassurance did not come. He reminded me of everything he had done for me, of the sacrifices he believed he had made simply by being present in my life. He framed my refusal as stubbornness, as ingratitude. I recognized the pattern immediately. Guilt had always been his most effective tool, and he was reaching for it without hesitation. Then came the subtle threats, not shouted, not explicit, but carefully placed. He mentioned being worried about my well-being. He suggested that people might misunderstand my decisions if I continued acting this way. The implication was clear enough. If I did not cooperate, he could make my resistance look like confusion. I felt a cold certainty settle over me. This was not about reconciliation. It was about pressure. I did not respond. Instead, I documented everything. Dates, times, phrasing. I kept copies of every message, every voicemail. I noted how quickly concern turned into accusation. The process was draining, but it grounded me. Facts have a way of cutting through fear. Emotionally, the cost was heavier than I had expected. There were moments when grief caught me off guard, sharp and sudden. I mourned the loss of a relationship that had already been slipping away long before I acknowledged it. The hardest part was understanding that I could feel that grief without allowing it to dictate my actions. Eventually, the messages slowed. Then they stopped. The silence that followed was different from the one I had chosen. This silence was meant to punish. It was withdrawal as leverage, a final attempt to regain control by absence. I recognized it for what it was and refused to chase it. The days grew quieter. I settled into routines that no longer revolved around anticipating contact. I walked more. I slept better. The house felt steadier without the constant undercurrent of tension. I was alone, yes, but I was not lost. What surprised me most was how my fear began to loosen its grip. Each day that passed without collapse or catastrophe strengthened something inside me. The consequences I had been warned about did not materialize. Instead, I found clarity. The realization that I could withstand this distance without breaking was deeply unsettling and deeply empowering at the same time. I knew this was not the end. The silence felt temporary, strategic. Sam would not accept a loss of control quietly, and yet, the escalation had already shown me exactly who I was dealing with. The manipulation, the implied threats, the willingness to undermine my autonomy had stripped away any remaining doubt. One evening, as I sat in the living room with the lights low, I reviewed the documents I had gathered so far. Everything pointed in the same direction. The choice I had made was already producing consequences, but not the ones I had been taught to fear. I felt steadier than I had in months. I understood then that waiting was no longer enough. Endurance had served its purpose. The next step would require action, not silence. The groundwork was laid, the pattern established. What came next would determine not just how this ended, but how I would live afterward. For the first time since this began, I felt ready. I stopped waiting for Sam to make the next move. Waiting had its purpose, but action was what would protect me. With the evidence organized and my resolve steady, I returned to the lawyer's office and placed everything on the table. Statements, timelines, saved messages, notes written in my own careful hand. Seeing it all laid out confirmed what my instincts already knew. This was no longer a private family dispute. It was a pattern that required intervention. The steps that followed were practical, almost procedural, and that helped ground me. I changed access to my accounts and revoked permissions that had once seemed harmless. I requested a full credit report and reviewed it line by line, marking discrepancies and unfamiliar entries. I closed doors I had left open out of trust and habit, replacing them with safeguards I should have put in place years ago. Each call, each form, each confirmation felt like reclaiming a piece of myself. There was a quiet satisfaction in doing this work without explanation or apology. I did not announce my actions. I did not warn Sam. I understood now that transparency had been used against me before. Clarity did not require permission. It required follow-through. The effects were immediate, even if indirect. I could feel the shift without a single conversation. Transactions that had once flowed freely stopped. The silence changed texture again, tighter this time, as though something had been cut off midstream. I did not celebrate that moment. I noted it, the way one notes a change in weather, and continued forward. What surprised me most was how calm I felt. The anxiety that had once accompanied every decision was gone. In its place was a steady confidence built on preparation. I was no longer reacting. I was directing. That distinction mattered more than I had ever realized. As the process continued, I confronted a truth I had avoided for years. Love without boundaries is not generosity. It is vulnerability without protection. I had mistaken endurance for strength and accommodation for care. Taking control back did not erase my history as a mother, but it did redefine my future as a person. There were moments when doubt tried to surface. Old habits do not dissolve quietly. I wondered how this would look from the outside, how others might judge a woman my age for choosing legal measures over reconciliation. Those thoughts passed more quickly now. I reminded myself that dignity does not depend on approval. By the end of that week, the path ahead was unmistakable. The mechanisms were in motion. Formal steps would follow, and they would not be private. I understood the cost of that visibility, but I also understood its necessity. Truth that remains hidden can be reshaped by anyone willing to speak louder. I was no longer willing to let that happen. That evening, I returned home and sat in the same living room that had once felt stripped bare. It looked different to me now, not empty, but intentional. Space had replaced clutter, and quiet had replaced tension. I felt the weight of what was coming, but it did not crush me. I had done what I needed to do. I had secured my footing before the final descent. Whatever came next would unfold in the open, supported by facts rather than fear. And as the sun set beyond the narrow strip of water visible from my window, I understood that this was not the end of the conflict. It was the beginning of its resolution. If you're still here and ready to see how this story truly ends, comment number 8 below to let me know you've made it this far. The final truth is about to come into the light. Let's move on to the conclusion. The call from my lawyer came on a quiet morning, the kind that usually passes without leaving a mark. I listened carefully as he explained that the formal steps had been completed and that the evidence I had gathered was now part of the official record. There was no drama in his voice, no sense of triumph, just confirmation. The truth was no longer something I carried alone. From that moment on, events unfolded without my involvement. I did not argue my case in public. I did not defend myself to friends or relatives. I let the facts speak in places where feelings no longer mattered. Sam tried to hold on to his version of the story at first, but it unraveled quickly once it was tested against documents and timelines that could not be explained away. What he had framed as concern was revealed as control. What he had called misunderstanding was shown to be intent. The resolution came through a settlement that left no room for ambiguity. The money would be returned. Responsibility would be acknowledged. The details mattered less to me than the principle behind them. This was not about punishment. It was about drawing a clear line where none had existed before. There was one brief moment when we were in the same space again. No raised voices, no accusations. The distance between us felt final, in a way words could not soften. I did not ask for an apology, and he did not offer one that mattered. We were two people bound by history, separated by choice. Walking away from that encounter, I felt something close to grief, but it was clean. It did not pull me backward. It simply marked the end of a chapter that had already been closing for a long time. I understood then that resolution does not always arrive with relief. Sometimes it arrives with acceptance. In the weeks that followed, life grew quieter. Not empty, just unburdened. I no longer checked my accounts with dread or listened to my phone with apprehension. The tension that had lived beneath my routines dissolved slowly, replaced by a steadiness I had forgotten was possible. I began reorganizing my days, not as an act of reinvention, but as an act of care. I chose what to keep and what to let go, both in my home and in my thoughts. The loss of the relationship I once believed in remained, but it no longer defined me. The truth had come into the light, and it stayed there. That was enough. My life is quieter now, but it is a quiet that feels earned. I wake up without the weight I carried for years, the constant vigilance that once followed me from room to room. The house is simple, intentionally so, and it mirrors something I rebuilt inside myself. I move through my days with purpose instead of obligation, choosing what deserves my time instead of reacting to what demands it. When I look back, I see a woman who believed love meant endurance. I believed that being a good mother required constant availability, endless forgiveness, and silence when something felt wrong. I confused sacrifice with virtue and patience with strength. It took losing the illusion of safety to understand how much of myself I had slowly given away. The hardest lesson was accepting that love cannot exist without respect. Concern that strips another person of autonomy is not care. Help that demands control is not generosity. I had to learn that protecting my dignity did not make me cruel or ungrateful. It made me honest. I also learned that age does not erase intuition. If anything, it sharpens it. The quiet unease I ignored for years was not confusion or fear. It was understanding, asking to be acknowledged. Listening to that voice changed everything. There are moments when grief still surfaces, gentle but persistent. I grieve the relationship I believed in. The future I imagined would unfold naturally. But grief no longer governs my decisions. I carry it without letting it steer me backward. Some doors must remain closed, not as punishment, but as protection. If there is anything I would say to other women who find themselves doubting their own reality, it is this. You are allowed to ask questions. You are allowed to pause. You are allowed to say no, even to those you love. Boundaries do not erase love. They reveal whether it was ever safe to begin with. I no longer measure my worth by how much I give or how much I endure. I measure it by how well I protect my peace. The life I live now is smaller in some ways, but it is honest. It belongs to me. This story is not about money or victory. It is about reclaiming self-respect after years of quiet erosion. It is about understanding that dignity is not something granted by others, but something we choose to defend. I did not walk away in anger. I walked away in clarity. And that difference has changed everything. Some stories do not end with celebration or applause. They end with understanding. They remind us that dignity is not loud, that strength often appears only after silence has done its work. Life has a way of testing where our boundaries truly stand, especially when love and obligation become tangled. And sometimes the bravest choice is not to endure a little longer, but to stop enduring altogether. There is a quiet kind of freedom that comes from choosing self-respect over approval, clarity over denial, and truth over comfort. It does not erase loss, but it gives meaning to it. When we learn to protect our inner peace, we discover that independence is not loneliness, and boundaries are not rejection. They are acts of wisdom. Thank you for staying with this story until the end. If it resonated with you or reminded you of a moment in your own life, feel free to share your thoughts in the comments. Your voice may help someone else feel less alone. Please consider liking this story, subscribing to the channel, and following along for more reflections like this.